Welcome to part 2 of the Shop Vac mobile cart assembly table thingy. In part 1, we solved 2 of the 4 requirements I had for this thing. 1 being mobility, it has wheels, and 2, that I can take the shop vac out, stick it back on the original bucket and have a shop vac. Now I'm solving the problem of usability, meaning I don't want 20 foot of hose just laying everywhere. I would much rather have it on a hose reel. I did look on Rockler, and they do sell these 2.5-inch hose reels for shop vacs or dust collection systems in a garage, but they are kind of expensive, and in the true heart of being a DIYer, I'm going to try to engineer and build my own. I'm fabricating and shaping the bracket that's going to hold the hose reel out of 3/4 plywood. I'm using a 2.5-inch hole saw, spinning entirely too fast, to cut the hole for one side, and then double stuck the other side to it and center punched using that bit to find the center on the other side. It's important that the two sides are lined up or centered, otherwise the hose reel will wobble. All of the blue pieces you see here I printed on my 3D printer, and I bought a bag of 1/2-inch marbles at Hobby Lobby, I think, to use as the bearings. The bearings are not entirely necessary. I could have just cut the hole the same size as the blue piece and let the wood ride on the plastic. But the bearings will make it a lot smoother and increase the longevity of the plastic pieces. These two pieces are going to be the center hubs that the dowels are going to be inserted into, and they have to be pretty close to the same size as well, otherwise the dowels won't line up. So I double stuck those together, used a flush trim bit to get them the same, and then drilled out some 3/8 holes all the way through for the 3/8 dowels. Once I had the bearing side fully assembled, of course, I had to test it. But spoiler alert, it didn't work whenever the hose reel was fully assembled. On the crank or handle side, I'm using a simple carriage bolt and a homemade handle to roll the hose reel up. So I drilled 3/8 holes for those. Now, originally I thought the square shank of the carriage bolt driven down in the plywood would be enough to keep the carriage bolt from spinning, but I did have to come back and add some 5-minute epoxy here to hold that carriage bolt. The crank handle is just a scrap piece of white oak that I had cut down and a hole drilled in it that will fit a 3/8 nut. On the other end, I drilled a 1/4-inch hole for a 1/4-inch carriage bolt that will be the crank handle. I also made the mistake of thinking that CA glue would be enough to hold this nut in place, but the pressure from the hose reel caused it to spin, and I had to come back and add some 5-minute epoxy on that nut as well. After dry fitting it all, I had to disassemble it, give it a round over, and then a coat of paint. To keep the handle from spinning off, I just added a backup or jam nut and tightened that with a wrench. This is butted up against the nut that's epoxied into the handle. Now to tackle the assembly table part. I'm creating some legs to support the top of the assembly table, which will be made out of melamine, and I mitered these to make legs that are L-shaped to give it a little bit of strength from racking. I don't want the legs to be directly under the melamine. I want them to support the frame that the top is going to be attached to. So in order to do that, I had to cut out I think it was 1.5 inch section that will create a little ledge that the frame of the top will sit on. But that will make sense in a minute. I'm using pocket holes to attach the legs to the top of the box or shop vac cart that I built in the last video. And to make the legs really strong, I used glue and some 18 gauge brad nails to hold it in place while the glue dried. While the glue dried on the legs, I hopped over to the frame for the top. And while it's not a true torsion box top, the way that I constructed it will help keep from twisting and maintain a level of flatness. Then I installed the legs, and you can kind of see that little ledge that's created from those cutouts I made on the bandsaw. Once I got those in place and centered, I had to test that I could still remove the shop vac top to change the filter or to put it back onto its original base and make it mobile for vacuuming out cars or something like that. Screws were the method of attaching the top frame to the legs, and just like any good builder, I jumped the gun and wanted to test out my hose reel creation. So I added a piece of plywood to the back of it to have something to screw it to the legs with, clamped it in place, and added some screws. Just like all of my other shop furniture, it got a coat of my favorite blue paint. And when that was dry, I could add the assembly table part of my shop vac cart. Pocket holes are notorious for walking or moving as you drill the screws in them, and a scrap piece of wood clamped to the side of the box kept the leg from moving while I drilled in the pocket holes. Now for the moment that this entire build has been, well, building up to, and that is to test the shop back with the hose reel.
Oh, that's not gonna work, is it?
Well, back to engineering. I was able to reuse most of the parts, but I did have to print a longer, 3D print a longer hub piece. The problem was the hub piece was not moving independently from the carriage that holds the spool. So I had to create a flange that sat down inside of it. And the gap between the flange and the cutout where the bearings are is so minimal that there's very little vacuum that's lost there. This old piece of 3/4 inch melamine is perfect for the top, and because I'm going to use the Z fasteners to screw it down to the frame for the top, I used the biscuit joiner to cut some slots for those clips to fit in. To protect the edges of the melamine from chipping and to cover up the plywood edges on the legs, I cut strips of this old white oak and glued them on. And once the glue was dry, I knocked down those sharp edges on the white oak with a chamfer bit. I didn't do any planning before building this, so I just got lucky that an entire 20-foot roll of 2.5 inch hose fit perfectly on this spool. And to save time and 3D filament, I cut down the original hub on the bandsaw in order to create a connection point for the hose coming from the dust stopper. I sealed it with a little bit of silicone and added some screws to hold it in place on the carriage. One thing I didn't record was drilling a hole through the carriage and into the spool to add a pin, because every time I wheeled the cart around, this happened. My list of criteria for this project were: number 1, mobility; number 2, horizontal work surface; and number 3, accessibility or usability. And this thing crushes all 3. However, I don't move it around the shop much. It kind of just lives over on one side. Because of the accessibility or usability, having a 20-foot hose, it can reach anywhere in my shop from the place that it normally lives. It does have a horizontal work surface that I generally keep stickered milled lumber as it acclimatizes to my shop. And the fourth thing was I wanted to keep it original enough that I could use it as a regular shop vac should I choose to. But having used it for several months, I don't know that I ever will. Thanks for watching.